Hello, this is Kelly Hill from RCR Wireless News. Welcome to today's RCR TV webcast on the Next Generation Network. I'm joined today by 4 participants from Dell'Oro Group and Tektronix Communications, and we will be discussing areas of innovation in next generation networks. Our discussion today will primarily focus on the radio access network and the core. Let me start by introducing our participants today. We have Chris DePuy, Vice President of Carrier IP Telephony, Enterprise Edge, Wireless LAN, and Wireless Packet Core Market Research Programs at Dell'Oro Group. He has more than 20 years of financial and business analysis experience, as well as engineering experience. Stefan Pongratz, Director of Mobile Radio Access Network Market Research at Dell'Oro Group. Prior to joining Dell'Oro, Stefan was with Enritsu Company for 10 years, most recently as a Senior Product Manager responsible for portable spectrum analyzers and cable and antenna analyzers used to verify base station quality. Robert Froelich is Director of Radio Access Solution for Tektronix Communications. He has more than 20 years of experience in the mobile and fixed telecommunications industries. Prior to joining Tektronix Communications in 2004, Robert held roles at Syneta Networks and Nortel Networks. And we're also joined by John Wise, who's in corporate communications at Tektronix. Gentlemen, welcome. Our topic today is the next generation network, and RCR has a special report released last week in conjunction with this webcast. That network report can be downloaded from rcrwireless.com. Now let's get into today's discussion. If we could start out with each of you addressing from your area of expertise, what next generation technologies and trends you see evolving in the network. Stefan, could you start us off?
Sure. So today, I mean, if we look at what's generating RAN revenues today, I would start out saying that network monetization has been a major driver the past couple of years. I mean, there was a lot of things have changed with the base station since the multi-mode base station was introduced. There's a lot of benefits with these new, more compact, energy effective types of base stations. So we've seen a large portion of the investments actually being allocated towards network monetization. There's still a very large aspects of the number of base stations that are still deployed before, I would say, 2008. Another trend that we've seen that's kind of picked up momentum is the antenna integrated radio. This is basically reducing the number of components. It's reducing the installation time. In some cases, it can be 30% faster than a typical macro site. So if you think of it from that regards, one of the main drivers for small cells has been the shorter, I would say, installation time that is required. And from that sense, the antenna integrated radio that's one of the main drivers. Of course, as well, once you reduce the number of RF components in the path between the baseband and the antenna, that kind of improves the S11 or the actual match and the insertion loss, and we've seen some performance improvements as a result of that. So I would say that's been a main trend. Otherwise, of course, we've talked about before the small cells in the unlicensed spectrum. I would say that the service providers' general view of how they embrace Wi-Fi, that is actually something we track in the wireless LAN report, but that is something that we've seen. That market has accelerated significantly, and that's something we expect to continue. The main trend we're seeing today on the RAN side, the final would include is the spectrum refarming. If service providers had a choice, they would probably prefer acquiring new spectrum, but that's not always an option. So there's been significant uptake in both the refarming 900 and 1800 megahertz for both UMTS and LTE, and that's something we're seeing mainstream right now.
Okay. Chris?
Yeah, okay. So today's trends in the voice core relate primarily to what's happening as service providers are planning to make a move towards voice over LTE, and what this is driving is new spending for IMS core devices and software, and away from what in history was called next generation networking, which is basically soft switches and media gateways. So that's what's happening in the voice core. In the data core, let's say the wireless packet core, we're seeing a move towards a newer type of equipment called evolved packet core. This is driven by the need to upgrade the data carrying parts of the wireless network as LTE rolls out. LTE is demanding new types of protocols and such, and that's why we're seeing evolved packet core grow. That's the primary source of growth in the wireless packet core. So those are the two current trends in the core.
Okay. Robert, what do you see from your perspective?
Like the other gentleman said, we see a large uptake. We've seen in the last 2 years U.S. large carriers implement both the EPC, the Enhanced Packet Core, and LTE. One carrier was doing it for packet switch to handle big data, another carrier to gear up for voice over LTE, or VoLTE they call it. We're seeing a fair amount of issues going past the functional test where the LTE isn't tuned, and there's some handset and NEM issues that we've seen signaling-wise that are preventing the rollout. So carriers are spending, as this gentleman said, quite a bit of money, but in terms of turning these up, there's some hesitancy because there are some issues in the actual FOAs that are ongoing. In Europe, they're about to launch LTE, so we're going to see quite a number of uptake there. Asia Pac, they're still primarily on 3G and even 2G. So we anticipate LTE and EPC being rolled out in about 2 years in Asia Pac.
Okay. Chris, since we're on the topic of VoLTE, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why service providers are trying to make those investments in VoLTE, and what the monetization is there, and in terms of talking about making money from implementing VoLTE.
Yeah. Basically, the reasons for making a move, for a service provider to make a move towards voice over LTE would be a list of things that would include spectrum, refarming, standardization of services on top of one single radio network, LTE in this case, and also to allow new services to be rolled out that are differentiated from circuit switching or over-the-top services. So those are the main reasons why a service provider might decide to move ahead with voice over LTE. The thing of it is that the costs for on a per-user basis for this new IMS infrastructure is pretty similar, if not even slightly greater, to the old NGN infrastructure. So the payback for making these voice over LTE related upgrades is not immediate. And in fact, if it was for voice only, it would probably not have a positive return on investment. So the thing is that in order for these investments to be resulting in positive returns on investment, we need other services to ride on top of the IMS infrastructure I was referring to earlier, and that would include things like rich communication services, location sharing, file sharing, messaging, those type of additional revenue sources would be needed in order to make a positive return on their investment.
Okay. Robert, I wanted to come back to you and talk a little bit about the radio access network. And what is it about LTE that makes the RAN so critical?
Well, the benefit of LTE, as everyone should be familiar, is higher bandwidth rates. Now with LTE, it's a new architecture from 3G. It's all IP, and the important radio resource control protocols that control the radio bearer and the radio interface is hidden. It's inside the ENO-B. So the way that the EPC and the LTE have re-architected by the 3GPP is the troubleshooters and the monitoring operational groups and optimization groups don't see the visibility that they have seen in 2G and in 3G, or CDMA networks. So in rolling out, there's a blind trust that the ENO-B is pretty well controlling the radio bearers in a fair manner. And what we've seen in collecting, and there's a 3GPP standard called TracePort that allows us to export this radio resource control signaling from the ENO-B and present it in troubleshooting monitoring tools. There's quite a bit of interesting information that can be seen, and we're seeing quite a bit of uptake from our customers to get that integrated into the core network monitoring solutions that Tektronix has been selling for quite a while.
Stefan, I wanted to come back to you. You had talked about small cells as one of the general trends that's going on in the radio access network. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the reasons that the licensed spectrum small cell market is growing slowly.
Yeah, I think here we need to start out clarifying, because the term small cell means a lot of different things in the industry. So I think now there's some consensus to split in the small cell market into, we like to divide into 3 categories, and I think the industries as well, it has now come to understanding that we call it the residential. We also split into enterprise and then public access. And then we also like to split the public access small cell market into the traditional small cells. Those are the ones that have been around since the probably mid to end 90s, picos and microcells, and then the new type of evolved small cell, and this is the lightweight, compact, integrated baseband and radio in one unit. And for this, so if you look at it from that perspective, we view it as the residential and the public access traditional. They're probably furthest along the technology adoption curve, I would say. Then, when it comes to public access evolved small cells, yes, we just started recognizing revenues for that. They are small relative to total RAN at this point in time. And the one reason for that, of course, is that if you look at how the early adopters have been deploying mobile broadband, it's been very coverage focused at this point, and the business case, of course, has been more favorable in this regards towards the macro base station. Once we then get into improving, the performance at the cell edge, indoor and at high traffic locations, there will be places where where the business case will be more favorable, I would say, for perhaps small cells in certain locations, that is. And the other aspect here, of course, is that the small cells in the unlicensed spectrum, they're a little bit further ahead. It's more of a proven technology, so that has been something that service providers have capitalized on. That has kind of freed up a little bit of that rush to get into improving spectrum utilization in the licensed spectrum, I would say. So in addition to, I guess, alternative technologies and the business case challenges, there's also the challenge of, this is a pretty big shift in overall technology, and you need to think about things differently. Things are going to be done in a different manner. And I think initially there was a lot of radios being introduced a couple of years ago, and I think the conversation is shifting right now. Service providers are trying to get everyone in the ecosystem to think more from a complete site solution. We need to identify where we're going to deploy these small cells, what's the exact location, how's the site acquisition going to take place, and all the other challenges, in terms of backhaul and access to power. So I think it's happening. I think there's a good amount of commitments out there. A lot of them a lot of the service providers are realizing that it's going to play a role. It's just more of a question of, it's not if, it's more when. And so there's a lot of trials and a lot of momentum happening, but we still see 2013, I would say, as an extended trial year, and then we might see some commercial revenues from some of the early adopters, but we definitely expect revenues to start improving in 2014, 2015, I would say.
Robert, I want to come back to you. We've been talking a little bit about both the core and the radio access network. In terms of monitoring, I think core monitoring has been pretty standard for operators. And can you talk about RAN troubleshooting and monitoring and how that's becoming more important?
Yeah, Kelly, RAN monitoring has always been important. You know, my colleague from competitor here has background from it too. RAN has always been monitored, you know, ever since AMPS days. You know, some of us had been part of operators, some part of the NEMs. And what we've found is the NEMs provide monitoring troubleshooting tools. There's drive test tools, and a lot of our voice of customer, we find between 15 and 30 different tool sets per radio access technology that the carriers use, both on the troubleshooting operations side and on the optimization. And the CapEx that carriers did not want to spend would be on hard probing. In other words, on the ABIS probe or the IUB probe. Very few you know, had the business case to actually tap 24/7 those interfaces just because of the huge CapEx and then the value that they extracted from it. With the advent of LTE and with the new base station controllers coming out, with the advent of the 3GPP group, is that we can now get this RRC access signaling data through these trace ports. So the LTE, as I mentioned before, the eNoVs provide trace ports. Even in 3G, there's a number of NEMs. Most of the major NEMs provide trace port. So that lowers the total cost of ownership. What that allows the carrier to do is to simplify their workflows and simplify the number of tools. They can reduce the tool sets from 30, possibly down to 5. Huge operation OpEx savings, you know, would enable them to see that vision, because one of the things that we're seeing in the part of the small cell discussion is the cost of maintaining a network. And for example, to us, we've seen large networks with 50 and 100,000 cells. It's going to be a factor of 10 when femto and carrier Wi-Fi and even the pico cells at LTE are deployed. So there's going to be 500 to 1 million cells that are deployed. And we know one carrier in Europe is holding back on small cell deployment just because they can't maintain and monitor the small cell. So that's a implement barrier that they have to resolve. Now, fortunately, in the monitoring and troubleshooting optimization, with the much lower cost, it's about a 5x decrease in cost in RAN monitoring. There's a path for these carriers to deploy these next-gen all-IP networks, you know, at a fraction of the cost of what they used to monitor their RAN networks.
And for those of us who may not be as familiar, can you take a couple of minutes and just talk about what carriers are looking for when they're troubleshooting the RAN?
There are a number of departments, operation departments, and I'm talking medium, large size customers. There's, for example, 30 to 40 different markets that, for example, would be located in the U.S. or Germany or Spain, Italy, for example. Likewise, China, you know, they have 100+ markets. So these operation groups and optimization groups use one set of tools. Now, the data that they collect would also be valuable in these regional and network operation centers. So right now, you know, this data is not transferable. You know, they have to pretty well export on a CSV file in Excel and email it to another group. They'd have to load it up. So the time to troubleshoot, you know, would take months that we've seen some of these complex problems, either on the NEM side or on the handset. For example, when Android and iPhone were released, we were involved with a number of those to troubleshoot and help to launch. So by integrating these tool sets in a 24/7 network-wide environment, these 10 different operation groups from a tier 1 all the way to Tier 3 and the CTO can access that data almost immediately. So a huge benefit of what we've seen in the last couple of years by allowing the integration of core and access data to be merged.
Okay. Robert, you mentioned different markets around the world. I'm wondering if Stefan or Chris, you could talk a little bit about regional differences in terms of investments that have been made across the RAN and the core. If there are some places that are generally at a different place than others.
Sure, I can start. I mean, from the RAN side, we typically see that there's basically 3 different types of mobile broadband adopters, I would say. First, if you look at the advanced LTE networks or the early adopters with some of the advanced LTE networks, I'm talking about places such as Japan, South Korea, and the US. They now account for 80% of the worldwide LTE subscriptions. So we've seen that CapEx and subscription migration has happened quite rapidly from 3G to 4G for those types of adopters. Then I would say on the other end of the spectrum, you have the markets in Africa, in India, other parts of Asia, where there's actually more 2G sites than 3G sites. And I think even for some of the service providers in India, there's still 8 to 9 times as many 2G sites as 3G sites. So we still believe that in many of those, for those types of service providers, 3G will be a dominant path to get to mobile broadband. I mean, there are some cases of early adopters there as well, where there's deploying LTE in select markets. But overall, we see that HSPA Plus will be the best route going forward. Then I would say you have in the middle of the road, that's where we find many of the European service providers. I mean, they have advanced 3G networks. They are committed to deploying LTE, and they actually already started deploying, in many cases, LTE. But they're also not going to be deploying LTE as fast, probably, as many of the early adopters did. So we expect there more of a, I would say, a balanced approach between HSP and LTE. So that's kind of a high level, the 3 different types. I mean, all roads eventually leads to mobile broadband, and it will depend on, where are you today, what's your spectrum position, what are your competitors doing, because that's what we saw when NTT Docomo launched LTE in Japan and Verizon Wireless launched here in the US. It's forced the competitors to accelerate their LTE deployments. Then, of course, the state of the fixed broadband will have an impact. I mean, in some places where, in Latin America and parts of Africa, where the overall fixed access is not that great, mobile broadband is a good alternative. And then finally, I think a big driver will be, we believe that scale and cost advantages of HSPA devices will be favorable in the foreseeable future. So that will have an advantage over LTE. So in the more ARPU sensitive, or I should say GDP per capita sensitive regions, that will also play a role. So I think that's a kind of a summary of the state of how to get to mobile broadband.
Okay, Chris, do you want to talk about regional differences?
Yeah, most of what I would have to say on this topic would mirror what Stefan has said. In other words, where the smartphone has made its way into the market, that's been a major driver to the wireless packet core investment. And then the upgrade from, let's say, 3G smartphones towards LTE smartphone markets, we've seen evolved packet core investments come to pass. And then on the voice infrastructure investments, in areas where there are still significant positive net additions of subscribers, such as Latin America and in Africa, we're still seeing an investment in next generation networking, in other words, soft switching and media gateway type of investments. And then in the in the regions where we see LTE rolling out, we're seeing IMS voice infrastructure investments. Now, as Robert was pointing out, the IMS investment has to get built first, and only after the handsets are adopted do we actually get further dollars spent. That is something of a disappointment now for the market. In other words, we had initial IMS investments, and now the handsets are not operating commercially as they were expected perhaps a year or two ago. So I know that's not a regional comment, but it is related to the topic of, when is that spending going to happen in the LTE-related regions we've already talked about.
Okay. One of the other big trends that we've seen this year has been SDN, software-defined networking, and this idea of both being able to run a network and network functions on commercially available devices rather than purpose-built hardware, and also the concept of network function virtualization and being able to take network functions as software rather than as hardware. Chris, can you talk about when you see the core moving in that direction and how that kind of plays out?
Yeah. Okay. So in the past 6 months or so, many vendors have announced various parts of their core products will be ported over to virtual environments, and this is called by many network function virtualization. Examples include Huawei and Ericsson's announcement of their packet core MME to virtualized environments, and Tektronix and Amdocs have announced their PCRF function towards a virtualized environment. We're seeing prototyping of various IMS functions by vendors like Alcatel-Lucent and Nokia Siemens Networks, and so these are announcements. We've seen good evidence that all these devices I've talked about are in the prototype phase, working their way through trials. Much of what I described there can be described as control devices as opposed to, say, packet processing devices. And the thing is that these control devices are sort of apt or most likely to be put into a server environment. And, well, that is the activity we're seeing in the next couple of years, control type of functions getting put into the virtualized environments. And that's what we're seeing in the next several handful of years.
Robert, I saw you nodding a lot. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, actually, TechCom's also going virtualized. In terms of the RAN monitoring, we're rolling out a VMware so that would be virtualized on an x86 server farm, which is one reason why the total cost of ownership of RAN monitoring is coming down. Packet processing, when there's dedicated hardware and microengines where you have to efficiently handle packets, that's a much tougher problem that, the PCRF, can handle control. However, on a DePuy, when you have FPGAs actually doing, the really hard work, that's going to be a real tough time to virtualize. SDN is a great way to lower the management of the layer 2 signaling. It would affect the core probes a little bit, where it's just the route, it's a new method of routing packets. So we're working with a couple NEMs of how the ecosystem works when SDN is rolled out within the EPC. But on the RAN, that monitoring is virtualized as of next month when we roll out the LTE probe. I know this isn't supposed to be a pitch, but sorry.
Well, and Robert, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but talking about core and RAN operations and engineering between them, often working separately, do you see that changing in the future with more collaboration between the two?
It's cold competition. Is your question between monitoring and the NEMs? Is that your question, Kelly?
Yeah, it's I'm just wondering if you see more collaboration there between as some of these things move forward, between the core and RAN operations and engineering?
Okay, so within a carrier, not necessarily the network equipment manufacturer.
Yeah.
Okay, going back in time, we have seen, not 100%, but we've seen disparate groups. There was a RAN group that wanted to do their thing. They bought their own tools, and then there was the core group that kind of did their thing. And only at the high level, the TAC 3 or the CTO level, were there a couple groups responsible for handsets, the RAN, and the core, and now the IMS, which supports VoLTE, of course. We're seeing more collaboration between the RAN and the core ops, and I'll also include the data center, because, for example, when VoLTE is introduced, we have media gateway controllers, we have media gateway, so we have nice RTP flows coming from the gateway and maybe to the POTS, but then when it comes to the RAN, if that radio bear messes up, the latency, jitter, and delay, the MOS that was calculated in the core, you paid for a MOS for nothing because the radio, either downlink or uplink, would have destroyed it. The customer, in other words, wouldn't be happy. So we're seeing more and more of the RAN operations actually working together with the core because they have to support these new all IP services. The circuit switch guaranteed bitrate bearer is no longer there. So these groups, and I'm not sure why, it could be management directive or this IPization is just forcing it this way.
Okay. Stefan, I wanted to come back with you. You talked a little bit about antenna integrated radios, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the drivers for those and and what's happening in that area of the radio access network.
Sure. I think I might have touched on this already, but I think the primary driver is really been that service providers, they make a lot of investments in their infrastructure. They want to, if they can, they want to be able to capitalize as much as they can of their existing investments. And this antenna integrated radio, there's some parts that can still be reused of the network, and it has shown to be a pretty good interim step or for service provider to take a more of a evolutionary or stepwise approach to the next step and generate some incremental performance, but still not with significant incremental investments, I would say. The main drivers are still, as I talked about earlier, is probably the main value is the shorter time to market, followed by the improved RF performance driven by the reduced number of RF components in the path, and then the fact that it's also smaller, lighter, and less load, and things like that. So I think we've already started seeing this being adopted in many parts of Europe and even in Asia and here in the U.S. And I think going forward, I actually think it's going to be a key trend going forward. We will see more versions of these antenna integrated radios. There will be higher order MIMOs, more spectrum bands supported. So I think it's going to be a very important macro base station going forward.
And what about the status of LTE Advanced? Do you anticipate that we're going to see a boost in revenue for RAN vendors from that anytime soon?
When it comes to, I would say the first phase of LTE Advanced, that's the carrier aggregation, that's starting to look pretty good. We just finished our 1Q13 RAN reporting cycle, and there was not a lot of commercial RAN revenue at that point for the LTE Advanced portion, but there are trials happening with the early adopters in South Korea, Japan, and the US, but also been reported other trials in Australia, in UK, and Russia, and they're making progress there. If you take that coupled with the fact that many service providers, they don't have 20 or 40 megahertz of contingent spectrum, so having the ability to actually combine your spectrum assets from wherever they are and still deliver high data rate services and the fact that we're seeing some progress on the device side. It was one of the more popular smartphones. They're now announced that they're going to have commercial smartphones available supporting carrier aggregation in South Korea next month, and coming more than likely in the second half of 2013 to the US. So if you look at I would say the incremental value that you can get from this technology, couple that with the incremental investments that's needed, because many times you can actually reuse the existing base station. I'm not expecting a completely new radio to be supported for this. So if you look at that, I think this is going to be, in my view, it's going to be a mainstream technology and it's not going to take too long, actually. I think we'll start seeing some revenues in 2013 and more in 2014.
Okay. Gentlemen, I'm going to wrap it up with one last question, and that is, what trends do you see coming over the next 2 to 3 years? Who'd like to kick us off?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Kelly. So in the next 2-3 years, we're likely to see a significant increase in the use of Wi-Fi by service providers. And what we're estimating right now is that a relatively small portion of that Wi-Fi data traffic is going to be sent over the wireless packet core that we've been talking about during this call. What's interesting about it is let's say a very subtle change might occur at service providers, where if they decide on a large scale to monitor the Wi-Fi traffic in a much greater way and provide a more seamless integration between Wi-Fi and LTE, it's possible this could be a very significant increase to the wireless packet core market. So that's the first trend, and I just want to reiterate that the next trend is this trend towards virtualization. Again, we see the control elements being really the major architectural shift in the next 2-3 years. So those are the two primary trends we see happening in the core of the telecom network.
Kelly,
Stefan? Oh, Robert?
Oh, I'm sorry. On the access, the trends that they were seeing, we know OpEx is either staying the same or going down. So carriers are looking for anything that they can do to roll out a new radio technology to support more subscribers. And that we were talking about earlier is the advent of small cells, be it femto, be it carrier Wi-Fi, or picocell, which hangs off the public infrastructure. What's really scary in the carriers now is just how to manage that with the same group of people that they have. Plus, they're adding a number of carriers per technology. Some carriers have 5 3G technologies in New York, for example. So just trying to monitor and optimize and plan what do I do next is becoming quite important and expensive. So therefore, we're seeing more and more interest in SON. The Next Gen Mobile Network Alliance group has great use cases for SON. They're high-level requirement, and some of the carriers are rolling out tools that have deployed SON. But as I indicated, we're seeing SON fail right now in Germany with one of our carriers because it still appears to be open loop. So there's more research and there's more collaborative relationships between maybe monitoring vendors and the NEMs to make SON successful. But that seems to be one area that's critical with this broadband mobile network, to be successful.
Okay. Stefan, did you have any more thoughts on upcoming trends?
Well, just to reiterate, I think overall we're very early in this transition from voice to data and towards mobile broadband. I think I like to tell people that for every one person that's covered by mobile broadband, there's another 0.9 people, or almost one more person that's not covered by mobile broadband. And for the people that are covered by mobile broadband, at least based on the latest Ericsson Mobility Report, many of those smartphone users, they experience, or more than 50 or 60% experience problems on a weekly basis. So I believe we will continue to making sure that everyone gets access to mobile broadband, and for the ones that have access, there will be an increased focus on improving the performance at the cell edge, indoor, and in the high traffic locations. And I think, I actually think there will be a lot of developments on the macro base station still. I think we will see more smaller type of macros, more compact, lightweight, lower power, still from an RF output power perspective, still greater than 20 watts and a macro type of, but I think we will see a trend of shrinking that base station. I think, like I mentioned before, I think there will be more versions of the antenna integrated radio. I think the momentum there has been good, and I think that's going to continue. The next mainstream, is, of course, as we talked about, is the LTE Advanced, the first phase at least of carrier aggregation. And then Chris talked about utilizing the unlicensed spectrum. I think that's something that's going to continue. And I think some of the trends, other trends will be network monetization. That's not going to go away. There's still a lot of base station out there that need to be modernized. We have spectrum refarming in the 0.9 and 1.8 gig bands. And finally, we're also going to get to improving spectrum utilization in the licensed spectrum. I think there will be eventually, we'll see some more small cells in the public access market. So those are some of the key trends I expect for the overall RAN market, I would say.
Okay, great. Chris, Stefan, Robert, thank you for sharing your insight with us today. A reminder to our audience that this webcast will be archived on RCR Wireless's YouTube channel. This is Kelly Hill from RCR. Thank you for joining us, and this concludes our program.